Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the channel for Monistic Idealism. I'm here with my co-host Kyle, and I am joined by a very distinguished guest, Professor Philip Clayton. He received a joint PhD from Yale University in the philosophy of science and the philosophy of religion, and he holds the Ingram Chair at Claremont School of Theology. We're very honored to have him join us on the channel today, so please welcome Professor Clayton. Howdy.
Hey, thanks so much for having me on the show. I respect your work very much and the quality of the discussions that have taken place here, and it's a privilege to join you all.
Wow, I appreciate you saying that. Thank you. And hey, what's up to you, Kyle?
I'm very excited for our discussion to have with Professor Clayton. I've got a lot of questions for the audience here and also a couple that I'd like to speak with him and see what he has.
Okay, great. So today, I know sometimes when we have a guest like this, it's more of an interview, but today's going to be a bit more of a discussion, actually. But yeah, so I guess we'll start off more with more of a comment rather than a question here towards Philip. So some people say that neuroscience explains all there is about mind, and since we cannot quote unquote find it, it's not there. So what would you say to someone who maybe says a claim like that?
Mhm. It's probably the major reason why I've done my work in idealism in the context of emergentist. Actually, it's emergentist idealism, but an emergentist philosophy. If we set it up in the beginning the way that some of our neuroscience friends have done, we have a dichotomy. And what philosophers do when they think it's a forced dichotomy is they'll fight to the death for their particular side. If we can get rid of that way of thinking, and I'll just say a dualistic way of thinking, and we can classically, one does that through dialectical modes of thought. More recently, we've done it through a sort of naturalized dialectic or emergentist thinking. Then we can find that instead of having opponents on the other side, we have discussion partners. In this audience, in this particular context, that's not so much of a problem, but most of the stages and lecterns I stand on, the people are already ready to fight to the death to make sure that my dangerous idealistic thinking doesn't gain a foothold in their auditorium.
Of course. Okay, and that actually leads me to another point that's actually very related to this. There are some people who say, specifically those like in modern context, Goff, Russell, Eddington, that they say, well, of course, mind is real, and they want to say, well, neuroscience can't explain it, and it's a limit of materialistic science that it's not designed to find the intrinsic nature of something. That science only tells us about the intrinsic, or no, science it only tells us about the structure and dynamics, behavior. And so, as a philosopher of science, what do you make of this comment here by these sort of modern defenders of mental realism?
Yeah, so there are a few pure instrumentalists about science or anti-realists about science. Nelson Goodman did that in Ways of World Making, an idealist title, by the way. Emotivist interpretations of scientific language, this sort of thing. But usually that's comment I have found is made in bad faith. What one does is say either one side or the other. On the metaphysician may say, oh, well, science can only give us an instrumentalist approach. Actually, to save the appearances goes all the way back to the introduction to Copernicus, De Revolutionibus, where he, in writing the introduction, or the Archbishop, I guess, said, nothing here should worry anyone. This truth is all in Scripture. These are just ways of saving the appearances. But in fact, the author of the position knew it was about far more than that. So the scientist can debarb herself, make herself seem more dangerous by saying, oh, I'm just saving the appearances, whereas she's deeply convinced about the realist referent of her language. Or the theist, the idealist, can say it's merely instrumental in order to protect the theological or metaphysical theories involved. I'd rather that we get rid of the pretenses from the outset. Virtually every scientist, especially in physics, often in mathematics, through biology, chemistry, is actually out to give, I'm just going to say it bluntly, true theories of the world. As a philosopher, I'm interested in finding true theories of the world, of what is. Let's admit that we're playing on the same playing field, even if we're playing slightly different games.
I think that's a good way to put it because, and I'm not sure if you agree with this, but because I kind of do lean more towards that instrumental side, where I do think science can actually, as an idealist, this is a little surprising actually, because I believe that experience basically is reality, and science focuses on experience. Science can tell us about reality, but what is it tells us about reality? I think that's a question that needs to be answered, and I tend to lean more towards on that side that it seems to describe mechanics, structure, dynamics, but I think physicists and scientists are out to find true theories of the world. But I think sometimes they may be mistaken in thinking that science does some things it doesn't do. But I do think science is a part of that.
Mhm.
It's just not all of that.
So let me role play your opponent, your scientist friend. And I would say, well, um, what I can see that you're doing is that you have a view that the truth can only be stated in the terms of an idealist philosophy, say monistic idealism, so that in your very first sentences, you've ruled out that I could do anything other than a more superficial description of the appearances themselves. But I can't get to that deeper level of reality that you alone have access to. So from the outset, we're not really having a productive philosophical discussion. Do you see? So I think that somebody who really understands that position would want to say, no, fight with me a little bit longer. Don't rule me out to the appearances yet, because we want to know what is of the essence of things. And I think I have some contributions to make to that. What do you think?
Oh, okay. So you think so would you say, so just for clarity's sake, so you think science can, would you maybe disagree, at least in whole or in part, with those like Goff who say science can't disclose the intrinsic nature? Do you think science can disclose the intrinsic nature?
I think science, yeah, so it depends how you use the term intrinsic nature. If by that you mean monistic idealism, then no. If by that, however, you mean that there are regions of what is, regions is going to turn out to be problematic in the end for both of us, but nonetheless, regions of what is where science can give us not only accurate or helpful information, but maybe even essential information for our task as constructive metaphysicians, then there is a real allyship. Even if when it comes to a term I often use in publications, ultimate reality, or UR, there will be strong limitations on them generalizing some of the particular insights that they've had. But in a region, if they can tell us things in the area of reality that they study that can help us do our work better, then there's more of a partnership. So what I'm trying to name, and I'm going to just ask you straight up, is it a partnership of that sort, or do we gain what they describe of appearances and then leave them behind when we come to philosophically true statements?
If I'm understanding you correctly, I believe I would say more of a partnership because how I see a science and the philosopher working here is that they're both in a sense trying to get at something about reality. It's just what parts of it that they're really kind of getting at and the tools they're using to get at it. And I just think science has its limits. You know, we need to distinguish between science and pseudoscience. You know, science has its limits. And if we try to expand it too much, it just becomes a bit kind of a free for all. And it can be a slippery slope, but not necessarily. And when it comes to the intrinsic nature stuff, yeah, I don't want to presume that means idealism. Those who make this intrinsic nature argument, they leave it open as to what exactly it is. They just say, well, science tells us structure and dynamics, tells us how it behaves, but it doesn't tell us exactly what it is. The answer to what it is, that could be anything. We don't know, at least in the eyes of science, is kind of the idea.
Right.
But some people are very materialistic in their science. They say science is materialistic. And so they kind of the people who do sort of have that view that yes, science can disclose the intrinsic nature, they can kind of be very materialistic. And so I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, perfect. So when the person takes a reductive materialist understanding of reality and uses science as evidence, then we have a bone to pick with them, and we're going to try to show that in the end they're wrong. When the scientist uses words like a region of reality or something, or an emergentist framework where each level is constitutive or expressive of the whole, then the allyship can proceed longer. And as a philosopher who asks questions about all that is, I'm interested in learning as much as I can from each field of study, though in the end, and here's where I think you and I definitely do agree, when it comes to putting all the pieces together, if you try to do that without philosophy and some other conditions that I think we'll come up with as we discussed today, you will have less adequate, you're less likely to have a true statement of the nature of reality. In fact, it's impossible if you won't play philosophy.
I agree. I could not agree more. And sometimes I worry because uh, in the climate that I was sort of developing philosophically, I was battling these materialists who are really affirming scientism a lot. And in my reaction against scientism, I don't want to overcorrect and try to, just throw the baby out the bathwater and just throw science out and be like, no, science is really not that great. It's only good for some things and that's it. So I do see science actually as helping us in this philosophical journey. In fact, I see neuroscience is very helpful in actually showing some of the problems with dualistic or even pluralistic frameworks. I think neuroscience can actually give us a lot of evidence, not proof, for a monistic framework. It doesn't prove idealism, but it's good evidence for monism. And I think I've heard you say before in a Closer to Truth video that you see yourself as a property pluralist. Would you see yourself as, would you still say you're a property pluralist? Or have your views changed?
Um, so I thought, well, there's two different ways to understand that phrase. One reason to be a property pluralist is to say I'm a skeptic, or we should be inherently skeptics about stating what the substratum is, as the hypokaimenon in Aristotle, that which holds all qualities. And I'm just going to speak about properties because I think that we have no way of knowing anything about that holder. That is a level of skepticism I don't think we should acknowledge, which means we have to ask about that which holds, the substratum or the hypokaimenon. And because, especially in idealism, we have a lot to say about that topic. So in that sense of property, sort of the limitation to a radical ontological skepticism, all we can do is describe the properties. So it's sort of a John Locke position in some ways. That I think we should say no to. But I do think that the analysis of the properties, in fact, your first comment in this discussion already shows that the analysis of the properties is essential for us to move from the appearances to an understanding of that of which they are appearances.
I think I'm glad you pointed that out about the importance of that substratum and how there are those who want to have this agnosticism about this. And I agree that we actually can know about it. And I know there's some who go the other way and say it's properties that bundle to substances, but it sounds like you're holding more that there's a substance that underlies the properties. And that's where I agree. And I think idealists do have something to say about that. But I guess what I was more so trying to get at is just like what your position, I guess, is now on, because I think in the past you've said you wouldn't accept the label of property dualist, but rather property pluralist. So but maybe I guess maybe what I should say is, are you a substance monist? Would you see yourself as a substance pluralist maybe as well, or?
Yeah. So that's a discussion that I hope we'll be able to go into in depth and carefully in this conversation. The thesis statement I would have is we're setting up the framework, which I can tell from the way you're correctly asking questions. We are setting up the framework for a productive discussion, is that without a dialectical approach to the understanding of ultimate reality, a word I'm not shy about using, we won't be able to come up with the most adequate answers. I was often writing for people who would not accept dialectical thinking of any sort. And I am, in that sense, I'm not a Hegelian, but I am a dialectical idealist.
Interesting. I just want to say real quick, Kyle, do you have anything you want to add here? I know you've been do you have anything to add to what he just said?
No, but we're just about to touch on, I guess, maybe grounding of what grounds these behaviors and how we can get into maybe the distinction between ontological versus epistemic realism, what the structure, etc. I think we just grazed by that one.
I know there's a lot of things we could have grabbed
Yeah,
onto. There's so many amazing topics that we could
yeah.
have latched onto there, but
But
oh,
actually, I do want to ask you this question, Jordan, because it feels like from some of the shows and some of the guests that there's often a battle between monism and pluralism. And there's a sense in which I would say that we should be monist and a sense that we should be pluralist. But just to say that one sentence is already to turn the eyes and thoughts of a person who studies the various families of idealism in the dialectical idealism direction. So maybe I should just turn the question back to the two of you. Is it the case that, as I just said, there's a sense in which all is one and the sense in which many exist?
okay, yes, perfect. That's a great question. So I affirm what's called priority monism, which affirms that there is uh, the one and the many as well. It's just that there is a priority of the one over the many. So there is a plurality of many different things. And when I say all is one, to be technical, I'm saying everything is internally related and it's all related to this one, which I identify as God. But some idealists can call it the absolute or the one or just the fundamental mind, whatever they prefer. But so that's how I see it when I say all is one. And I like your panentheism. By the way, I would see myself as a panentheist. So, Kyle, did you want to answer his question there?
For me, I definitely hold to Jordan's view there about priority. However, when I do talk to different people like David Scribner or John Leslie and that and so forth, um, it depends how they describe certain avenues of if it's the parts that are prior to the wholes or wholes prior to the parts or the structure prior to the intrinsic natures. Then I can kind of bleed into maybe a panpsychism or an idealism or a non-reductive idealism. I don't know. It depends how you would define it, but for me, I think the mental definitely seems to ground the intrinsic nature of what we call the physical. However you want to see if that's the universe as a whole or how we kind of chop things up, like if an airplane's flying through the air, you have everything interrelated. It's not just a plane. You have weight, you have the lift, you have the thrust and the drag, and without the air molecules, it's all connected. So you could see as a whole, but if you need to chop it up for, kind of like how we humans see those things, I yeah, I guess you could see parts, but I don't know. I don't know. I think the mental would definitely be the intrinsic nature, I think, if we could have a view for that, but we'll get to that later.
So in light of this statement of three positions at the outset, Jordan, as you're guiding us and leading us through the discussion, one thing I want to make sure we don't fail to get to is if we call the one God, and your position and mine are very close but slightly different, can we understand this term God in terms of an absolute monism? Can we understand it as the one? Or what are the options available in forms of idealism through the centuries and across cultures? That is one of the most fascinating questions of all. And people often don't, actually, the number of discussion partners who can do this discussion at a sophisticated level is very small. So I'm hoping that we could reserve time as you're scheduling out our time to make sure we get to that question, God and the sort of absolute idealism.
Absolutely. And I know that you have some thoughts to
Absolutely, no pun intended.
yes, no fun, correct. And I know that you have some other thoughts to share about other Eastern traditions and how they relate to this as well. And so I'll just say this for our dialogue. So there's a couple different ways that you could look at the one here. Though McTaggart, J.M.E. McTaggart was an atheist, there are those who are very sort of a McTaggart
Yeah.
idealist, but also theistic, where they might see the one really as the many in a sense, which is very hard to conceive. But basically, it's not one individual that is the one. It's all of us united by love together, and that's a very rare view. I don't have a name of an author I can give you for that. That's just
Oh,
people
I
I've
can
encountered in
mention a
life.
number of people, but so bring us to that point. Give us time. I think it comes later in the conversation, but I think you or both of you have thought of things that we might want to clarify on the way to that conversation.
Yes. And so where we are right now in this conversation, because I know we've gone over several different topics here, some of the last things that we were touching base on was monism, pluralism a second ago. And I want to get a bit more clarity about your view of substance as well. Um, so I see myself, hopefully I'm not getting ahead of myself or going backwards here too much, but about, because I think this is actually important. In today's modern discussions about the mind-body problem, it goes back to this whole monism, dualism, and monism is seen as having this advantage, substance monism, you could say. And so I lean in that direction. And I know there's a different kind of monism, right? With priority monism and all that. And that's a whole other ballgame. So it's good to have, our terms be clear so we can have a productive dialogue. And so I want to make that distinction clear. And so I just want to know for you, do you see yourself as a substance monist?
Yeah.
Or are you more substance dualist or do you kind of reject that terminology perhaps? Or what do you think?
I'm really glad you took us there, because that was the other thing in your first Zusammenfassung, your first sort of summary of where we were at. That was the issue that we should most talk about. So you know that in German idealism, leaving behind substance thinking was a crucial part of the constructive work that Kant, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, and minor figures did. And Dieter Henrich got millions of dollars when I was studying in Munich in the philosophy department for Konstellationsforschung, research into the whole constellation that gave rise to the four great figures of German idealism. And the minor figures are very interesting, but maybe not worth $26 million, their texts to get there. So for the German idealists, to move into idealism was to leave behind the category of substance in different ways. The details of that, well, we know it in Kant's critical thought, we know it in debates between Fichte and Schelling, but we know it most clearly of all in Hegel, for whom transitioning from the concept of substance to spirit was essential for an adequate idealism. I am persuaded by that. I'm persuaded by that in terms of the history of modern or German idealism. Actually, the same applies to the British idealists, Ewing and others we could talk about. But I'm as much or even more convinced of that from the standpoint of the philosophy of science, because it's just nothing that one can do constructively with the notion of substance in, I'll say, in any of the major empirical sciences, which overstates it a little bit, but nonetheless. So I would say that the burden of proof would be on one who wants to think through her idealism using that term.
You know what?
What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's actually very interesting. I think that ties back a little bit, perhaps, to what we were saying about intrinsic natures and what science is capable of doing. That because I noticed you added that qualifier at the end about within the scope of science, for exactly how you worded it, but through the eyes of science. Yeah, you can investigate these properties, but substance is sort of not really in that scope. And I think perhaps that's correct. And I think we should just not limit ourselves to science is all. The metaphysician can step in and say, yes, we can investigate substance. And as an idealist, though there are German idealists who maybe want to do away with talk of substance, I embrace it. Those like George Barkley said, it is spirit, the self, that is the substance of reality. And I tend to side with him on that. I'm
okay,
not
wait, Jordan, wait. That's a great place to go back to, because I understood Barkley making a transition from an Aristotelian notion of substance to the switch to spirit or mind as being omnipresent, and admitting more or less that the word substance wasn't doing work once you get to idealism. And I'd like to know whether you think that's a misinterpretation of Barkley. In other words, my statement is more general than you don't need substance in the sciences. I would say you don't need substance once you've turned to mind or spirit as the fundamental ontological reality.
Okay, so you would interpret it just the way when Barkley uses the word substance like this, you think he doesn't really he's not really affirming a substance. He's actually kind of moving away from that towards spirit. I'm just making sure I'm understanding you. Is that correct?
Your quotation, that quotation does suggest that he's moving away to spirit. But the other reason is he has minds and thoughts of minds as sort of the core ontology. The thoughts do a fair amount of work in his exposition. The understanding of mind is not as rich as we would want. But beginning with maybe the later Leibniz, but definitely as the 18th century progresses and into the early 19th century, we have incredible reflections on the nature of mind, Geist. In German, it's both. And so I would say that either Barkley is limited by the notion of science from a deep phenomenology of spirit, of des Geistes, right? Or Barkley isn't limited by the notion of substance. He's just not very profound in the understanding of the phenomenology of des Geistes.
I would definitely, especially that last part, I would agree. I think he was, I think he's just kind of beginning this process of this mind first ontology, however you want to phrase it. And so, yeah, I think he did have more to develop there. The how he saw mind could have been developed more. He used it very generally. But let me see if I could actually find this quote real quick, just for the sake of the audience here, because I know you're not saying he didn't say this, but you're saying just that that you think he means something else different by it.
Yeah, the way that you delivered the quote a few minutes ago suggests that, okay, what you guys are all talking about substance, great. If you want to think about substance as spirit or mind. But if that's not exactly the quote, then I can't be interpreting it correctly.
Okay. Yeah, because I think actually you might have just got it just right there. Okay, yeah, I guess I'm not able to find it right now. I don't know where it is. But anyway, so yeah, so just for clarity's sake, for the sake of the audience, yeah, I do hold to a very substance ontology. I don't see I see the substance is spirit. I don't see a duality there. I don't see a dualism and how one is real and one isn't. I think it's all one, I guess. And but everyone's free to agree or disagree. There's
So,
clearly
Jordan,
a tradition of idealists.
yeah, so let's
who
try to
disagree.
let's see if we can get it sharper. So there's a sense in which I could agree, and that would be this. In much of the history of Western philosophy, it doesn't generalize to the other traditions. Substance has been a central notion. It's done crucial work in the insights obtained across the centuries. At some point, idealists began to say we need to understand substance as mind or spirit. And then a rich phenomenology and a metaphysics and linked to theism and all incredible developments happened. In the process, what began to do the work was the analysis, metaphysics, and phenomenology of mind or spirit. And the word substance ceased to do that kind of work. So if we just took a literal reading of substance theory in, say, Aristotle, we find out that though the word is transitioned into the contemporary debates, the insights are coming from elsewhere, namely from the metaphysics, theology, and phenomenology of spirit or mind. And therefore, we can retain the word, but it's not the driving force for philosophical insight any longer. That would be my position. I'm interested if you think that's wrong.
Okay, no, I think that's actually very important to give that history and to say that just for myself and the audience, because I think substances, even if it's just in name only, there is this sort of comeback that's happening. There's a scholar, Ralph Weir, who's writing a lot about this. He's great. And so it seems like it's still there, but maybe it's not doing what it used to do, and we could just have spirit do that perhaps. So I think that's something that perhaps there's people in the audience who could be really nodding their heads to this. Like, yeah, that's who I am. I'm a German idealist, so I feel the same way. So, okay.
Can I throw in a second argument while we're on this
Sure.
topic, Jordan?
Sure.
So I spent 8 years writing a book on idealism, The Problem of God in Modern Thought. I wrote it first in German and then translated it into English, and gave a lot more credit or looked in more detail at the early stages that led to Kant. So Kant before the Preisschrift of 1770. And one of the key figures of that period is Lessing. And Lessing deserves more attention for those of us interested in idealism than we've often given him. There's a dialogue that allegedly took place in 1758 in an evening after drinking wine, and Lessing died soon thereafter, it was published after his death, so he could never refute it. But many of us believe that this could well have been a comment that the older Lessing said. This is after Nathan de Weise, after Nathan the Wise. Somebody said, his discussion partner said to him, who later wrote this up, so I sense that you are more influenced by Spinoza than many people might realize, or Spinoza plays a deep role in your work. And he allegedly at the dinner table said in German, well, the first words are Greek, yes, the hen kai pan, I know no other. So hen, the one, pan, the all. So the one and all, it's a reference to Spinoza, but really through him back to Plotinus, I know no other. And I think that this interest in the one is far more crucial in understanding modern idealism than we often give credit for. And I could spend a lot of time talking about that in Kant, in Fichte's ongoing quest through 1803 to do a Erkenntnislehre, a theory of knowledge, in the Atheismusstreit, the atheism debate of 1799, and obviously in Schelling, and also finally in Hegel. And in the own monistic idealism that you vertreten, that you defend also. So if the Hin Kai Pan is so crucial for understanding modern idealism, and unless we're going to say there just exists one substance ultimately, and all the rest are appearances, so if we are Spinozists in the strong sense, then yes, we keep substance. But if we want multiple substances, now we have a conflict between where idealism has led us and where Aristotelian substance theory would take us. That's a very sophisticated question, Jordan, but it's one that might be low and outside pitch for you.
Well, no, yeah, actually, and I see room for another, a third way here, where perhaps you have mind as prior to, or as more fundamental to the other ones, you could say. If there are other substances, then perhaps you could have that. Like you've heard of non-reductive physicalism, I would imagine, and so
Yes,
on.
I've fought with Nancy Murphy for decades over her
Nice.
version of it. Yeah.
And so, there could be said, a non-reductive idealism. I don't hold that, but instead of you have mind, or instead of matter giving rise to mind, you could kind of have it the other way around, where you have, yes, there are multiple substances, there are multiple properties, there are many different kinds of things, but we are idealist in that sense because we put priority or fundamentality to spirit, mind, whatever you want to call it. And so, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, if you agree or disagree.
No, definitely. That's a fascinating argument. Cal, did you want to jump in? I was watching your body language.
Yeah. What do you have to say, Kyle?
I'm really enjoying the dialogue between the two of you. I don't want to interrupt the train of thought because I do want to bring it to something separate.
Okay, so we'll go to Kyle's in a moment. I'll just answer this one and then you guys take it where you want to. A substance in Aristotle is a thing that exists in itself. It's not a quality that's dependent on some other substance. It's not a quality of a substance. Right? A substance is a thing that exists for itself. In the axioms of book 1 of Spinoza's Ethics, he radicalizes that definition. Oh, it's actually the theory. Well, no, it's already in the axiom. If a substance can exist, is something that exists in and of itself, there can't be two substances, but only one. So if you had an idealistic metaphysic, and you said, but within this idealism are physical substances, that would be a non-standard use of the term philosophically.
Yes, absolutely. I think this language, it's funny because in physicalism, non-reductive physicalism is kind of new. It sounds dualistic sometimes, or where it's like, yes, there are mental, irreducible properties that are distinct from physical properties, but we're still physicalists, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of tension there, and I agree with that. I actually think that's I have many issues with that position, but I just think it's, I've heard some idealists try to just flip the script and say, well, it's all, there's mind, but there's also some things that aren't mind, that aren't mental, They just emerge from the mind. And so you could call that a version of idealism. It's certainly not monistic idealism. You could call it dualistic idealism, perhaps, or pluralistic idealism if you're playing with the word plural here a bit. And obviously, it's a view I don't believe in, but I think it's an option available even for Christians because even those like William Lane Craig, the way they talk about their dualism is they say that, well, there's God, spirit, and he creates the physical world, and they distinguish the physical from the non-physical. But notice how there is a priority on the non-physical. You start with God, spirit, non-materiality, and then creation occurs, and now you have materiality and physicality. So you could say that all Christians, if they're Orthodox, are in some sense, if they're not monistic idealists, perhaps they're dualistic idealist, though this lingo is not used often. I see it there.
Okay, that is fascinating. I'm going to express my disagreement, but I find this really a rich topic and one that I'm going to want to reflect on more. So, metaphysics is the drive to state those principles that are most basic for the nature of reality. And it would seem to me that that these two positions are both, you say in German, Vorstadien, preliminary stages toward what would be the metaphysical answer. And then I'm going to say there's a third stage, however, which could be a part of a metaphysics without breaking the metaphysical quest, and yet do justice to the existence of physical things. So that's a little bit complicated, but see if I can do it in a brief and clear way. My attacks on non-reductive physicalism in print over more than 20 years are clear. I think that you don't call something a physicalism if it isn't in the end a physicalism. So if it's, and that points us toward the need of something, this position, but without the name physicalism to it. So I'll hold that in abeyance. Second, when you speak of, how do you say it? A dualistic idealism?
Yeah.
I take that to mean that there's the mental, but I'm also a dualist, so there's also the physical. And then the question is the dualistic adjective a Vorstadium, a preliminary stage to really understanding what this idealism is? Or if it's co-constitutive, so then one's a dualist, like a Cartesian dualist, maybe with interaction, but there really are physical things, there really are mental things, and maybe somehow they're related or not related.
Right.
In metaphysics, well, I'm going to stop there, and then I'll say the third approach would be to work one's way, and this is metaphysics as a journey. I'm actually deeply drawn to this view. I'm going to work my way up by looking around us in the world. What seem to be most fundamental, let's say, physical particles. I'm arbitrarily starting there and not with quantum physics for obvious reasons. And then we watch them join into more complex systems, chemical systems. We watch them forming a unit that can self-reproduce. So the emergence of life, and we follow it on up the incredible qualities and thoughts that physical beings called human beings have. So that would be the kind of emergentism that I've spent most of my life working on. And then at some point you say, now that we've seen this emergence up to a being capable of conceiving God and seeming to enter into a relationship with God, and then you have, as Aristotle says somewhere, a switch into another genus. So now we need a kind of thought without negating this world which we live in, this embodied human being that we are. We need some way to speak of something more ultimate that alone could explain this entire realm of physical law, physical interactions, patterns, correlations, the appearance of freedom, and so forth. So that emergentism could lead to some form of idealism as the most ultimate. And in that third position is where I would locate myself.
Absolutely. And yeah, you've been delving into emergence for a long time. And I'm wondering if this terminology that I'm about to bring up to you here I wonder if you've heard this before. I'm really hoping you have because you've delved into this for so long. You could call emergence, where there's a rising up. There's the parts to the whole. And you could reduce the whole to the parts or say, no, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. All right. But what about a submergence where you start with the whole and you work your way down to the parts? And you could be a strong submergentist or a weak submergentist as well. And I kind of see myself as I'm not saying there's no emergence at all, but like I kind of like this idea of a weak submergence where you're actually starting with the whole and you break it down to the parts. And perhaps there's a recombination of those parts as well. But I see a lot of advantages to this actually. I could delve into those if you want, but I just think what were we gonna say?
I was going to say the concept we see widely in the history of metaphysics, but the term is misleading. If we speak of an emanation outward from the one, or from a divine, or a creation outward from a divine source that's pure spirit, then we can speak of the arising of a physical world. And for Plotinus in the Aeneids, in the 7 books, it's a movement outward and return, as we see actually in many metaphysical systems around the world. So the emanation of the world outward from the Hin Kai Pan, the one and all, its various qualities, and then for Plotinus in volume 7, the movement back, the return, mystical return back to the one. Well, since we already have the term emanation, why would we need submergence?
So, because how I see it is, well, with emergence, like you said, it would be an outward creation. So, as more of a panentheist, I see it more as an inward creation, sort of how the dreamer creates the dream world, and so it's sort of like that. That's how I see it. I think it fits more with panentheism. There is a submerging within the one. There is a fragmenting within the one, and everything is contained by the one. The one subsumes all. So, that's how I would see it.
Okay, we can get clarity on this, and this is fascinating. So because I'm willing to take the premise, the key question is within the one, and I know you're ultimately an idealist about the one. So within this ultimately idealist frame, does it give rise to, are all qualities mental or spiritual or idealist, or does it give rise to actual physical, rocks? I mean,
Yeah.
that just are rocks and nothing else.
Yeah.
So this would be a non-panpsychist position. Is that possible?
I would say if you're a strong submergentist, you could look at them as they are physical rocks that are distinct from mental things. So like, yes, there's you could have a duality there. But my take would be, yes, there are rocks. I just don't see them as physical. Everything's mental.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and then that one is terrain that we're well familiar with from your show
Yeah.
and discussions, and those are all the versions of panpsychism, which I trust we'll get into. So I feel like we've got some clarity on this and what's similar and different in our vocabulary, the way it could be brought together and the way it couldn't be brought together. So I feel like we could put a end of a paragraph there if you want to. I'm also aware that we keep not letting Kyle talk.
I know. I'm glad we keep checking in on him. We're both aware of him. How are you, buddy?
I was good. So this is going to be a dramatic shift.
Yeah.
I think we've already probably discussed it already, but it's just at the really start. It's about your views. I don't think you would be sympathetic to eliminativism about the mind, or even a Mysterian, where it's like, well, we don't know what it is. But after talking to a lot of like primitive philosophers like David Skrbina, Chalmers, etc., that's the one thing we do know, and everything else you could say is kind of I don't know, a representation or something you could say. But I just wanted to hear your thoughts about. I don't think you're an anti-realist about mind, or what your views are against eliminativism. I would say just to start with that.
Yeah, they're all attempts to use physical explanations, so cause and effect of material sorts, to explain all the appearances. And it's simply my position, along with others, that we don't succeed. It's an interesting project. Science is engaged in it, as certain views in the philosophy of mind and in neuroscience have engaged in it. And I don't think that they've been successful. The thing that you end up explaining is not the explanandum, the thing to be explained, namely human experience. And you could extend that in animals and so forth, but the easiest being human experience. Even one's own experience of oneself is not fully explained. Daniel Dennett glories in saying, well, we're just completely deluded. Follow the experience in on the optic nerve, go through all the nerves of the brain and come out with an action. You still will not have ever found the spirit. Therefore, we're purely material. And I just don't feel that explains the appearances. It explains them away, as I think Dan Dennett gloriously affirms. And he passed recently, right? So I say this with due respect, as somebody who's debated him in multiple stages. But it just does not seem like the most philosophically adequate view.
I think many would agree with that. I mean, we've already heard with Galen Strawson and Dan Dennett over the years too. But so in that case, eliminativism seems
we can eliminate it.
hey,
Nice.
like that. And then the next one would be, just before we go into the grounding, is Mysterianism about mind. Previously, we talked about Noam Chomsky with Bernardo Kastrup, and Noam Chomsky is a Mysterian about, well, the stuff of reality, right? He won't say that, well, the mind doesn't exist. It's that we don't know per se. And when people say, well, then if it's an arrangement of matter, he says, well, first off, we don't know what matter is. There can't be a materialism if there's no, well, matter, right? And we don't know what that is. So my question for you would be, would you put yourself in kind of a Mysterian position about mind, a little bit of agnosticism? It doesn't sound like it, but just for clarity's sake.
So I think that we have to make a wager every time we do metaphysics, that it must be possible to say something rational and to rationally discuss these broadest, most difficult questions that the human mind is confronted with. If we bet against ourselves at the outset, and that's how I define Mysterianism, then we don't get to do the conversations that this show and many of our favorite authors are engaged in. And it is part of the human adventure to ask the hardest possible questions. I gave a series of lectures on freedom in Frankfurt some years ago, and Jürgen Habermas, a philosopher whom I incredibly respected, was in the audience. And so we would go out to lunch with groups of people or just the two of us. And he had a mind that was willing to think about anything. There was no question that he didn't think that we should try to tear apart and bring the best resources that we have to make sense of. And that, I think, Habermas and people of his ilk are a great counterexample to anyone who says, let's just start with the Mysterion.
Fascinating. Okay. So here, let's dial it back I'm trying to do a step-by-step procedure, see if we can get to the next question, which would possibly be about the grounding and your view on panpsychism. So if we're able to get rid of eliminativism and probably illusionism with that, Mysterianism, like you said, would be a leap of faith, etc. But if we do take that view, monism, in the sense as discussed prior, non-Mysterianism, non-eliminativism, after talking with Hedda Hasselmark, who is a great philosopher of mind, worked with William Seeger, etc., they do talk about the grounding, right? What gives this stuff we talk about its intrinsic nature? Because you can't really just have, I mean, you can have structure and structure and structure, and it's turtles all the way down, as John Leslie would put it. But there seems to be something that needs to ground it. And the only intrinsic nature that we know of that does ground things, well, is mind. There could be other stuff, but we know it because we are that stuff. We are that from the inside out, right? So in that view, I'm interested in what you would think about intrinsic natures and a sort of panpsychist perspective, a strong sort, not where there's a level where, well, it can't be there and then it emerges out of it, but it's there, whether you can say proto or full panpsychism.
No, you've looked, okay.
Yeah.
Good. So I love your question. I want to give an answer that I haven't often heard on this show. but I think needs to be in the mix. And that is the question of starting point. And it emerged at the very beginning of today's discussion when we talked about where regions could science, it was my very first back and forth with Jordan, whether there could be certain regions where science brings knowledge, brings justified true beliefs that we have reason to affirm and that we can use as part of a broader project that the scientists may not in the end be interested in. I think that there is, from the standpoint of philosophical clarity and gaining as much knowledge of getting all the phenomena on the table, there is an incredible value in looking at the history of the cosmos and the kinds of things that it's produced. Even if we want to say in the end, in the beginning, God. But to begin, and that's, Hegel does it in the phenomenology. Many philosophers have covered much territory to get to where they wanted to go. Oh man, so many examples come. We could do an hour just on that topic. And so I say, let's get to the questions you're asking about by studying the things that we know causally, the things where there's the greatest agreement among the people who've studied them. So that would mean we're going to say there's some gray, for example, in getting from quantum field theory to the birth of the cosmos. There's some gray in getting from non-life to life. So let's just let that stuff be gray and really focus on what we can know. So then we move up to a physical being with very clear lineage back through the entire life from the first single-celled organisms to humankind, and then to the content of, well, then to psychology, sociology, anthropology, right? The various things we know about how humans develop, and then to philosophy and theology, right? And so we have an incredible amount of material, and in an emergentist framework, we can put it together into a fairly convincing scientific and, I think, philosophically adequate framework. Then we come up to the problem that we have ideas of things, ultimate values, mathematics, and metaphysics, ultimate reality, that were not a part of that scientific story. Sometimes, so for me as a young evangelical Christian, I would jettison everything that came before. Now I know God, everything else is of no value whatsoever. I don't think that's the best route for a philosopher, however. We want to take everything we've learned along the way, retain it, and then face this puzzle that the source of all these things can't be, it sounds like set theory, can't be a member of the set that we've studied so far. And we have to move to another genus, to go back to the Aristotle expression again. And that's the point where a doctrine of creation, so a reality before this creation, something after the end of this universe can come into discussion, ins Gespräch. A nature of realities that are not ground, don't have a physical basis at all, and therefore idealism come into the discussion. And what we have to do then is correct the account that we've given. We don't get rid of it, the correlations and the local knowledge, but the big picture story of what we had been discussing changes. I think the three of us and many of your listeners are very comfortable with that switch. And idealism is one of the ways that we describe what it is. Panpsychism is another form of that. And you see that in the career of Whitehead. I've been at Claremont School of Theology for most of my career, and the Center for Process Studies is still the mecca of Whiteheadian studies. He looked at the best theories of fundamental reality of his day, especially his unique work in the late 1910s, and found out that in the end, we needed to say that an occasion, which is not a physical thing, is more prior, and he developed a form of panpsychism. I'm going to stop there because I have a nuanced reaction to that, but I think that's a great example of how you can do all the studies of knowledge available to us through the empirical sciences, encounter a metaphysical correction, and then rethink the status of that entire realm of knowledge from the standpoint of what you've been forced to acknowledge as you've tried to put all the pieces together. There's my life program in one long paragraph.
Excellent. I think that's also, yeah, if you really want to do away with substance, then Whitehead's your guy, for sure. You know what I mean? Yeah. call back to that one. Kyle, did you have anything else you wanted to say real quick?
No, I just wanted to say really quickly. So with what's been placed on the board, I mean, you do have your position too, but it does sound like you are sympathetic or open to those forms of panpsychism and idealism too. So there is more of this on the playing field than just saying it's A or B and that's it. There's other things that you do take that would be a valid position, like monistic idealism, I guess a process panpsychism a la Whitehead, etc. So those are parts that you would do hold as being valid.
Yeah, I just would say that there's one limitation.
Okay.
We probably won't have time to go into it, but there are times when you you can take a philosophical position which is very attractive in philosophy, like panpsychism, and then you read it back and you try to interpret that the history of the universe in light of that. And there are times when you don't affirm it as the more ultimate. This is so hard. It's rarely do people talk about this. So I'm a proto-panpsychist or an emergentist panpsychist, things I've worked out in various articles over time. In a doctrine of creation, for example, if everything stems from a purely a being of pure spirit, then you might say that there couldn't be actual empirical reality or physical reality. I don't think that follows. It could be that you would say, therefore, pure spirit can set aside natural law, physical laws at any time. I don't affirm that for reasons. So what really interests me in terms of this broader project, which very few people have done enough work, both in the sciences and in the history of idealism or history of metaphysics, to engage in a sophisticated way. But there's certain times when we don't just wipe out the causal physical universal history in light of what we've discovered at the end in metaphysics, but we have to find ways to integrate them, even if it's sometimes an uneasy alliance.
No, I agree. And this is one of the things I have found beneficial about my more monistic approach, because to me, it's like, it's not even that there are two things that need to be integrated. You know what I mean? It's all spirit to me. Like all things are spiritual, and that includes science and things we do that aren't science. And so, um, to me, it's just, I think Christians and non-Christians alike, whatever, they should feel very comfortable exploring these domains. I don't think it's a threat to their faith or their atheism. I think it's just, as you already said, you can do science and have many different perspectives. You could be a panpsychist, you could be a materialist, you could be a dualist. I mean, science doesn't commit you one way or the other. And that's, in my opinion, at least, that's what I believe. I feel like that reinforces the idea that science truly is limited. It's great. But when I hear people say things like a scientific view of the world, whatever, I mean, science is it's great, but it's limited. It only does so much. I mean, we shouldn't limit ourselves to that. Just be open to what's available. Think about it. Don't
Yeah.
just point to the guy in the lab coat and be like, well, whatever he says.
Yeah.
Like you got to think about it. And I just think there's I don't know. I don't know. I guess I don't know where I was going with that, but
No, but that leads to a fascinating question, and I'd love to see where it takes the two of you. So we've done the study of the physical world. We've come to the level of metaphysics. We've looked at the various options. Let's imagine that some group of us has taken idealist answers. Now, the key question is, do we understand the status of all things whatsoever that exist, including that physical world, quote, physical world we've been studying, as not really physical, so that the notion of a physical world turns out to be an illusion in some way? In that sense, we would be like Hindus in the Advaita tradition, where we'd say that all of the appearing world around us is Maya, M-A-Y-A, is illusion, and only Brahman exists, only the absolute. And there are versions of panpsychism which have that ring to them, so that it's just, say, regularities in the properties of spirit is what people have come to call physical. But metaphysically speaking, that's a mistake. They aren't physical at all. Or do we say, no, there actually is a physical world, but in some ways permeated by spirit? That's maybe the biggest metaphysical question the three of us could address.
And I would say the former. My answer would be
Yeah,
that. I
I
would
thought so.
say, yeah, so it's all mental, it's all spirit. To me, I had a whole video on this. The whole notion of physical is it's very dubious to me. I'm not really sure what it means. I've read a lot about it. I've heard a lot of people try to tell me what it is, and every time I try to analyze it, I'm like, I don't know. It doesn't. I'm not really coming back with a whole lot. You don't have to define physical for me. I'm not challenging you to do that. I'm just expressing
Yeah.
my own thoughts here that I just don't see any need to use the word physical, I guess. Science is empirical. Science is based on experiences, observation. And if I can just describe things in terms of experience, observation, and so forth, I don't see any need to use the word physical for anything. It's real. I believe objects are real. Tables and chairs, you, me, we're all real. I just don't see any reason to call it physical, I suppose. So
And
that's
Kyle,
just
you're nodding your head. So you held the same position as Jordan.
I think that's really attractive because Galen Strawson does talk about this in saying that if we do draw a dichotomy between what's experiential and non-experiential, from our point of view, we don't really have anything that's any evidence for anything that's non-experiential. You could say, well, the rock, etc., but if you go back to Bertrand and Russell, Eddington, they would say, well, the stuff that's out there is essentially mind stuff in their words, right? So it could be of higher levels to like a kind of like an emergence, right? Where more of that mind stuff, but at the bottom it could be a simpler kind of mind stuff, but it's still present. And then maybe as the universe as a whole, it's more complicated. And that's where we went back to the absolute versus the prior. That's a tough one. But I think what Jordan described is, yeah, that it's tough.
So there are two counter arguments. I'll name them and then you guys choose which would be more interesting for you and your listeners.
okay.
The one is physical cosmology, and the other one is Christian theological. Funny allies here. In current cosmology, we think that quantum field theory of all the areas where we have equations is the most fundamental. Out of quantum field theory, we can develop an understanding of how particles emerge as localized as they're distillations of the quantum field. You guys probably have covered that on the show before. But what's really interesting about that is that it's both the case that the energetics of a field come first. My doctoral advisor, Wolfgang Panenberg in Germany, made a lot of pneumatology and connection with field concept. And if he had read quantum field theory, he would probably have stated that even more strongly. Okay, so, but out of it, the distillate really is a particle, a physical particle, and the composites of particles are the things that make the physical world. So the one argument would be that out of a base, which is energetics, come physical objects. So there's one argument we could explore, and the other one is Christian theological. So this religion in its classical form is tripartite human anthropology, but at least two parts. There's soma and there's pneuma, right? Body and spirit. And the eschatological hope in the Christian tradition has been the reuniting of the two. Now, it might be in 1 Corinthians 15, it's a new body, soma pneumatikon, a spiritual body, but it is nonetheless still a body. So in fact, that very contrast in 1 Corinthians 15 suggests that this world has physical things, and then it is sown, it's buried mortal and raised immortal, right? It's the physical body becomes a spiritual body in a kind of redemptive transition. So that would be a different article, a different way of arguing for at least a dualism and not an absolute idealism. Which of either of those would you like to explore?
Oh man, I'll do both quickly if you have time. If you have time. So when it comes to, and this is obviously a hot take, a lot of disagreement will be laid upon me for this. Quantum mechanics, as you know, it's about how these particles, they're fundamental particles. I believe particles are real. I just don't think they're fundamental. So I think there's this implicit, this atomism that's there in a lot of physics that's, I think, inherited from materialism, where they think it's atoms in the void. They think it's these little particles building up to form big things. And I think it's the other way around, actually. You could
Well, you and I agree it's the other way around. So we agree that either spirit or a quantum field, some sort of energetic field comes first. But so the physical picture, the standard physical picture is physics picture is this field, but then the actual existence of particles, which are also real. So all I'm trying to do is defend the existence of a dualism. It's funny we switched positions because you were arguing for, didn't you say dualistic idealism earlier on?
well, I said that was an option. I said like dualistic idealism is an option. Of course, I'm
I'm
a monist.
grasping it.
Yes, good, good. You are. I really appreciate that too, because like it's not talked about enough. But basically, so I think what to address it briefly, I think when people talk about modern physics and quantum physics, I think there's sometimes an implicit atomism there that I don't see. But it sounds like
No,
you actually don't. But you
no,
don't quite see. Oh, you
right.
disagree?
No, I don't. But I can't be a pure idealist about the distillates of the quantum field. They actually are real particles according to physics.
Oh yes, yeah, I definitely agree that they
But you
are
can say they're
real.
mere appearances. They're not actually anything other than energy or spirit.
So yeah, right.
That's your position, right? Okay.
Yeah,
Okay. What about the Christian side?
yeah, right. So remember when Jesus when the Son became man, right? He of course he is God, but man is made in the image of God. God became visible. So how I see when Christians talk about the body versus the spirit, there's the spirit, which immediately, and then what you're calling the body is just experience, what you're able to see, what you're able to touch, and all of that. So think of like the objects in a dream. Okay, you can see tables and chairs. You might think they're not real, but we're putting that aside. Let's assume they are real, but it's a dream, okay? It's a mental body. It's a mental object. It's not distinct in kind from spirit. There's you could even look at it as part and whole relations one way. That William Blake says this, that what you're calling the body is just the part of the soul you can see. So this is just the visible portion of this with your senses, with the eyes and the touching and all of that. So maybe there is a dualism in that sense, but it's not a strict metaphysical dualism where spirit and body are two different kinds of things. It's just here's the part of the spirit you can see, and then there's this part of the spirit you cannot see. So that's how you could look at it there. But I know most Christians don't look at it that way, but I think that's available to Christians where you can be a Orthodox Christian and a monistic idealist.
And just a brief follow-up question on that. It seems to go against Christianity's own self-interpretation in the New Testament. Would you say that? Which seems to say,
I actually would disagree. I think there's authors like Nathan Jacobs who argue that the church fathers,
I know Nathan, yeah.
yeah, affirmed a kind of metaphysical idealism. So I think even a lot of Orthodox, more in the Eastern tradition,
Yeah.
I think there is very much a rich monistic and even panentheistic with St. Gregory Palamas kind of in there and all that. So, but I completely understand why someone would disagree with me because especially in the West, it's like obviously there's dualism. Hello, body, spirit. I mean, sounds very dualistic, right? So I completely get that questioning.
Good. That's very helpful. That actually clarifies your position for a way that I hadn't got from some of the shows. Kyle, do you come down in the same place or are you different?
Similar, but I might have a nuanced opinion about something prior you said. You said spirit or energetic stuff comes first. So as we did talk about, particles are excitations of the field, but there's 17 fields, I think, right now, and the goal is to hopefully boil them down to one. But if that one field is an excitation of that mind stuff, I kind of see it as an interesting avenue where both can come in and say, well, it is the mind stuff. It's there always, and everything that happens within it, well, that is like a panentheistic quasi-cosmopsychism, idealism, you could say. And you don't really have to worry about was it Christian or is it this? Because the mind stuff is present there. You could argue it's prior to. We could talk about the fine tuning and natural laws that come prior, which would sound like an idealism, but I think that's also maybe like a third way, but you probably already thought about that one. Yeah, I think that would be another option if you don't have any.
Good. So I hear you guys' positions as close, and you can hear me trying to argue that both the scientific argument and the scriptural argument lead to the reality of something that is not mind, that is actually physical. So the reality of a physical world. I'm really interested in talking about God and absolute monism. Do we have time to get that in,
Yes, as
Jordan?
much yeah, as much time as you would like. I know you had some very interesting thoughts about some of the more Eastern traditions as well. So whatever you'd want to touch base on, feel free.
So, but can I be clear? I bring this up not because I have a position I want to hit you over the head with, but because this is in my entire work over the decades in this field. It's the one that continues to trouble me the most. I remember being at a conservative evangelical college, one that actually in those days believed in the dictation theory of scripture. And it is named Westmont College in Santa Barbara. As a philosophy major with some brilliant professors who I'd like to give credit to for my career, like Stan Obitz especially, and a person I was best man in his wedding is still a philosopher at Westmont. That's James Anderson, um, Jim Taylor. But here's the problem that has remained with me. Well, we know it most clearly in the history of Western philosophy in the debate that Fichte was involved in. He wrote an essay in 1799, gave rise to a huge debate. He lost his position at one of the best universities. He had to move to the East because of this so-called Atheismusstreit or atheism debate. And he basically said, we've talked about the ultimate ground, and many people have called that God and have said that God is personal. But a person, and thanks for what you guys shared in the chat here, a person only exists in relationship to another person. So that you could not have a person or a personal being in the absence of an other person-like entity, so another person, that one could interact with. So if we identify the absolute one, Hin Kai Pan in Plotinus, with the personal God, we have a contradiction, a conceptual contradiction. So those two must be separate. I'm just going to stop there with a statement of the problem and sort of see where it takes you guys. But I have worked on this in every tradition in every century that I could get access to over decades and wonder where the two of you come down.
Yeah, I see myself as a personalist, and so I do see personhood there. And I'm not just saying because I'm a Christian or anything like that. I think metaphysically, I think I have been drawn to that. But there are those like who follow F.H. Bradley, who kind of have this non-personalistic conception, and even Bernardo Kastrup, who's a modern idealist, is very non-personalistic, and that seems to be growing. Um, that's so interesting how it goes all the way back to there. This isn't just a 19th century idealistic thing. They've been going at it as well. And I just think there's a lot of strength for personalism.
But how do we answer this specific objection? Because we're also absolute monists.
Okay, so to me, it's like, see, I think a part of the problem is how the question is phrased. You see, sometimes we load the dice. Sometimes it's like, did you, do you beat your wife kind of a thing. I think I suspect it's kind of one of those situations. The way we're framing the question might be problematic. Can you rephrase the question or just
Yeah,
or restate
right.
it?
So let's imagine that some group of people say, yeah, in the end, I'm a monist. There's one thing that exists. And Fichte will say, or here as I represent him, that's great. I can see a lot of reasons why one would want to be a monist, but you can't be a monist and ascribe the quality of personhood to that one, because the notion of personhood is intrinsically relational.
Ah, okay. So some could argue that. And here's one way, I guess this is where I might betray what I said earlier. It's funny because if you're a Christian, if you're a Trinitarian, actually I feel like you could make sense of that because God is three, so God is
Right.
relational. But if you're not a Christian, I feel like maybe it would be a little difficult, actually. You may, in fact, want to say something like, okay, well, if persons are relational and there is this one, perhaps everyone else is fundamental as well, because the one would have to relate to the many. And so there's a
Oh, okay.
there's a co-eternality there, you could say.
Brilliant. So now I'd like both of your answers. The only two ways, I'll overstate it, the only two ways out of the Fichte objection are first, classical Christian Trinitarianism, or second, the external existence of the world with person-like entities. Both of those, if they're accurate, would be sufficient to answer the objection. But I don't think, do you accept the view that there's always been a world as long as there's been God? That's Whitehead's view.
No, I would
I
say
didn't think
no.
so. So we'll
Yeah.
take that second one off the table. So are you going to say then I can be a monistic idealist only because I'm a Trinitarian, conceptually speaking?
So I've never really thought that far. I never thought of it like that before. I'd probably have to think about it more,
Well, Kyle
which
knows.
might be
Look at Kyle's
disappointing.
expression. You can tell that he's ready to
Yeah,
answer.
what do you got there, bud?
Could you also take the view of Bernardo Castro where you do have dissociation between it? So the perceiving selves or whatever they are kind of a cut off whole from the mind of God, you could argue. And that even though they're relational, they're still part of the whole in such that they're dissociated, like a person with dissociative identity disorder, right? It would just be like a little bubble coming out of the ocean, but falling back in and still being that. So the separate personhood would be illusory, but the fundamental subjectivity that is present is the whole, and it is relational as it is ebbing and flowing throughout existence. And then that's hard for the Trinitarian.
So here's one other, it's if I'm not cutting you off here, because here's one other way you could look at it as well. So you could look at it like imagine there's a mountain range. It has many different tops. And when you submerge that mountain range in water, when it's submergent, okay, it might look like there are many different islands on the surface of the water. If you were above the water, you'd think, oh, there's many different disconnected islands, many different things. But if you were to just lower the water, oh, it's all one big mountain range. So perhaps one possible answer to this is there is the many and the one, but really the many just is the one, just sort of submerged, however you want to interpret that. And so I don't know.
So I want to plug a book called The Many One, which just appeared. We worked on it for years and it's just out. It's a collection of 12 amazing authors. And the editor is Oliver Griebel, Griebel. See, Kyle's looking for it on the internet. Make sure I got the title right, Kyle. But he's a German friend from Stuttgart. There are a number of German authors, but some really leading Western English language authors as well. And it was published by Cascade, so Wipfenstock. I strongly recommend it on this question. It's got some brilliant suggestions. Also a radical paper on my part that
This will be the non-duality stream of thought, because I do have Griebel here, the many one, right?
Yeah, is that what it shows as the title? Good. Yeah, just wanted to plug that book for people interested in this question. I think we wanted to get to one more question I can see you guys talking about in the chat. But the hardest part for Christians who engage in metaphysical discourse at the level that you guys and your listeners do is this question of personalism, the personality of God for an absolute monist. And it does turn out to be one of the most difficult questions across the traditions. I'll just give one example because we ran out of time to talk about India. Maybe we could do that another time. And I also can recommend some Christian thinkers who really know that metaphysical tradition well. The most fascinating debate at all is between Advaita, but they're both orthodox schools within Vedanta Hinduism. So Advaita Vedanta is the non-dual, and Vishishta Advaita, which is the qualified non-dualism. And the funniest thing is the purest pantheist, sophisticated pantheist in any tradition, in any point in history, is Shankara, in my view. So much to say about that. So his position is the most radical position in Sanskrit. You say Nirguna Brahman, or the ultimate, without attributes, Nirguna Brahman. So I'm actually a follower of Vishisht, of the school of Ramanuja. and his is Saguna Brahman, so Brahman with attributes. But even the purest pantheism that had ever existed, Shankara, with his negative theology, still affirmed three qualities. Satchichananda, they write it as a single word, Satchichananda, being. We could, in the West, we'd say, oh yeah, you have to affirm being. Consciousness, seat, and ananda, bliss. So if consciousness is present, then you have an absolute idealism, which is also conscious, which is somehow then probably not less than personal. So, but we need to understand how we could come to that conclusion, because it might be a resource for Christians who are monistic idealists or absolute monists.
Absolutely. I mean, and they've been thinking about it for so long. It's too bad that we're running out of time. I would love to hear more of your thoughts about these Eastern traditions, because there's so much wisdom. They've thought about it for so long.
Yeah.
And it sounds like we're just catching up to them. I
Yeah,
mean,
exactly.
really,
Exactly.
they thought about this thousands of years ago. So
I think the most sophisticated panentheism in the world is Ramanuja, but that's another story. So, but we should end in the last 5 minutes with the topic that you guys want to choose.
Am I okay with the resurrection thought? And then maybe we can do a part 2 in the future if
yeah, if he's available, if you'd
okay,
like
yeah.
to, sure. Yeah, go ahead.
This has to be one of the biggest questions that I was able to find on the internet. It was on Closer to Truth. It was the resurrection under a panentheistic emergentism. So God basically holds on to your subjectivity. And people are saying, well, what's that like? And etc. And there has to be a question saying, well, it must be kind of like that non-dual philosophies from the far west, right? God holds on to that, what would be, it's basically what would be there in a deprivation chamber when you're totally amnesic. There's still that subjective sense of I-ness, right? And that's kind of interesting because it bleeds back into that personhood about it's all kind of there. But anyway, I want to hear what your thoughts are.
That's a great question. I'll do it briefly so you guys can do follow-up comments on it. This stems out of a debate about Whitehead. Whitehead's view of what happens after death is called objective immortality. So every moment in your existence, so it's called every actual occasion, is kept in the mind of God. So every moment of every psychic entity, every actual occasion, is preserved in God. Nothing's lost. Kind of like Star Trek mind meld, right? In the original series between, think of 4 and 5. 3 and 4. And a lot of us think as idealists that that's not sufficient because the subjectivity, the subject is not preserved, just the distillates of its experience. That's inadequate. Some years ago, Margie Suhaki, my predecessor in the Ingram chair, so it was John Cobb, then Marjorie, and then myself, took the position of subjective immortality in a book called The End of Evil. And our subjectivity is preserved forever. So that comes closer to the Christian gospel, but not with a physical substrate. So this is very fits for a Whiteheadian or for an idealist. So our active subjectivity is perceived forever within the divine. You need panentheism for this, but that works. And yet we don't lose the subjectivity, and we still have inputs from the divine spirit and maybe from others as well. Preserved, active, subjective, but not with a physical body. Rather, the spirit of God becomes the substrate that the physical body, some people say, is in this world. What do you think? So resurrection is Jesus' spiritual. So it's a spiritual resurrection. We are spiritually resurrected. We don't have bodies in heaven, but we have full subjectivity and therefore the other teachings of Christian eschatology.
Sounds like a purely idealistic existence there, doesn't
You would love it.
I would.
It's made for you, Jordan.
Oh, man. I mean, you guys have never seen my body. I could be there right now. You don't even know.
Exactly. No, I'm fine with that. I will have 3 new questions for you next time if it's true. But yeah, so any difficulties with that? It's an understanding of Jesus' resurrection, also our resurrection, our immortality, and panentheism and idealism all coming together into a single coherent position, which many would say is consistent with Christian scriptures.
What's there not to like? I don't know. That sounds great to me.
Kyle's frowning, so he's seeing the problem.
It's
No,
over.
I
It's
think
over.
the panentheistic view with the idealism holding the subjectivity, you can have either or, and I think you can have both together, and that's hopefully where we'll get to part 2 in the future if you have time. So
Yeah. So I know
Awesome.
I know you're running out of time, Philip. I just want to say thank you again for your time. We really appreciate it. It's a big honor to get to speak with you and to get to record a video with you. And you gave us a lot to think about. I've got some stuff to ponder here. So thank you once again.
Well, thank you guys. You're great discussion partners. I knew it from listening to the show. I get invited to be on a lot of shows that you wouldn't want to get to with the 10-foot pole, but you guys really you have a great audience, and you bring together amazing discussions that are, for me, not only intellectually, but also spiritually, life-giving. So thank you for having me, and I look forward to future discussions.
Excellent. You're definitely right about the audience. You guys are great. Thank you all for watching and listening. And please share your thoughts in the comments on what's going on here. God bless all of you. Take care. Bye.